So welcome everybody to our meeting of the Victoria chapter of the Australian Academy of Liturgy. This year has challenged many of our settled assumptions about worship in Christian community. Here in Victoria, we have had one of the most severe lockdowns in the world, which has included the closure of churches. For many people of faith, this has marked a rupture in relationships in church communities and has marked a period of time without access to the sacraments. Through the last few months, our chapter discussions have explored some of the questions this experience raises. We recognise that there are implications for this in broader questions about the mission of the church. What comes next? And we also have explored critical views about online celebrations of the Eucharist. Today's presentation moves into broader questions about community trauma and grief and how church communities support change and reconstruction after the disruption that we have experienced. We are privileged and joyful to welcome Tanya Witwer, who is joining us from South Australia. Today's presentation arises out of her paper, Pastoral Considerations for a Pandemic, which began life, I understand, in Tanya's involvement in a committee dealing with questions of what to do with the pandemic, just when COVID was indeed very novel. For those who aren't familiar with Tanya, she's worked in community service and the environmental sector and in population health as a chaplain, counsellor, training facilitator, ministry associate, manager, program director, lecturer. Really, the list goes on. Rather refreshingly for a presenter in the Academy, she's a self-confessed church nerd and loves liturgy, loves preaching, even loves listening to others preach. And she has a passion for pastoral care. Tanya was until recently the postgraduate coordinator at the Uniting College of Leadership and Theology, which is part of the Adelaide College of Divinity and Flinders University, and she is now a lecturer in pastoral theology there. Her previous teaching was in public health and counselling and psychotherapy at the University of Adelaide. Tanya's key research interests are in homiletics, pastoral care, formation, power, violence, and women in the church. And she is fascinated by all manner of things and so delights in multidisciplinary research. She lives in the Adelaide Hills with her husband and a family that has elastic, happily not ring of steel borders. So Tanya, it's a real joy to welcome you and to hand over to you to lead our discussion.
Kieran, and I would like to begin by adding to your own acknowledgement that I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I'd also like to invite those of you who share my circumstances to join me in recognising that as immigrants to the country I call home, I benefit from the colonisation of this land and have a shared responsibility to acknowledge the harm done to its first peoples and work towards respect and recognition. So may our time together be part of our work towards our ministry of reconciliation. And the reason that I have such a broad and probably shallow CV is, as probably applies to others of you, being a woman called to ministry in a church which will not ordain her. I'm a member of the Lutheran Church in Australia. So, first question, that of context. We have people online today from a range of different contexts regarding COVID. Here in South Australia, it almost feels in many places like business as normal, everything's resumed, People are resentful that they can't have coffee or have just started having it anyway and finding ways around the restrictions, while many of you have not been able to meet for worship face-to-face for a very long time, and there are others that where face-to-face worship is possible but not recommended, and some who are entering lockdown again after a time of no lockdown. So many and varied contexts, and that's great because it means that there's no way in the world I can claim to be an expert on you and your situation and the context you find yourself in. And I always think that's a good thing for me to know. Before I go any further, I would really just like you to have the opportunity to share with each other how you're travelling. I have 2 questions that I'm hoping you can talk about just for, 4 minutes in breakout groups, small breakout groups. How are you travelling and how's your faith community travelling? So, Kieran, I leave it with you. How are you travelling? How is your faith community travelling?
Great. In one moment, you will all be assigned to a random breakout room. At that point, everybody can unmute.
Now, this next little bit is going to look a bit familiar to people like Annika, who was on a presbytery meeting some time ago with me, but I just want to put in a bit of theory, okay? So I should share my screen and find my PowerPoint. Here we go. And that is, yeah, that's on full. Click, 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 click. So, just organising myself a bit better here. When I think about liturgical and pastoral responses to COVID-19, I particularly think about how liturgy is a dialogue between God and God's people with worship of the living God at its heart, and it's mutual and relational, with the awakening of the soul, for healing, for forming, for evoking, all of these kind of things. Also very aware that MINS 300, providing pastoral leadership in a pandemic, probably wasn't on your seminary schedule. So few of us had actually rehearsed for the pastoral challenges of COVID-19, but for those of us that were blessed to have a theological education, a ministry education, the foundations for responding appropriately were present there in what we were taught, that that all pastoral leadership takes place in this multi-layered context which changes over time. Well, just more change. Back when lockdown first started, I had a look at the literature so that I could try and learn what I could. I could predict what was going to happen ahead. And the literature says that the disasters which have the greatest impact are those which have the loss of and threat to life, that are broad in their impact, that have serious and ongoing financial implications, and I would add a 4th one to that, which is about duration. We've been living with uncertainty regarding so many aspects of our lives, and in some places a real and genuine threat to self and those we love for an extended period. And while we can hope for a vaccine in the middle of next year, we just can't predict what's going to happen even for a year ahead. And the phrase collective trauma is one which is used to describe that, well, Erickson's quote, something like a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. When I had a look at the book Pale Rider by Laura Spinney, written a couple of years ago before most people were contemplating that a pandemic might be happening soon. She wrote how after the 1918 Spanish flu, unlike other disasters, there was much less of a fear of the disaster pulling people together. The pandemic tended to isolate people much more. The impact on individuals tended to be much more uneven than for many disasters, so separated people rather than brought them together. I think probably for you, as for me and my community, initially there was this real sense of coming together, all in together, great flexibility, resilience, but that's dropped off over time. And how we respond as we move forward will really depend on whether the changes that happen are changes towards vitality and life or decline. Now, with collective trauma, even though it's collective, it's not the same. Individuals are very different in how they have been affected by it, whether that's because of external reasons or because of who they are and the way they individually respond. So local conditions are different from one area to another. There's generational differences, there's occupational differences, and of course, as I said, the individual response. When we look at literature on recovering from disasters, on healing from collective trauma, there's a number of sites that have various versions of a graph on sort of what that healing looks like, how well-being will go over a period of time. This is the one that I put together back in March, drawing on what I knew of other disasters. And the thing that's really important is this little bit here is the disaster time. Now, for Victoria, quite a few bumps along the way there, but even in South Australia, definitely in the UK, still we're in this phase, which is actually the impact phase. The impact of COVID is with us until there is a vaccine. And we now can treat it much better, so that's improved. There is a sense in which the economy in some places is starting to stabilise, but there are individuals within that economy who are now at the point of losing homes, losing livelihood. So still very much the impact phase. When we come out of the impact phase, there's initially this a bit of a rise up. Everyone's morale improves. This happens too, even within this impact phase, say Victoria coming out of lockdown, the possibility for those that haven't been able to of church face-to-face, there's going to be a bit of a euphoric sense, but it's very likelihood that will drop again. And certainly once we're really completely out of COVID, we can expect quite a disillusionment, quite a drop in emotional well-being and morale in churches. And then a long, slow time of working through grief, working through change, finding what the new normal, if there's such a thing, is, reconstructing our communities, our congregations, working out who we are, who we want to be, and to use some words from Michelle in the chat earlier, the assumptions that we hold about worship and Eucharist traditions and how they will play out then for the future. Now, the time frame that I'm looking at over this is something like 5 to 10 years. With a normal disaster, we're always looking at least a 5-year time of healing. This one, because it's been so erratic and the length of the disaster is so much longer, I would anticipate at least a 10-year timeline till we reach this kind of reconstruction, reinventing ourselves time. Oh, and yeah, that's the URL for the article that I wrote in Stimulus magazine on pastoral considerations for a pandemic. In that article, I drew on a group of experts in recovery after a disaster who came up with 5 key principles for enhancing individual and community mental and emotional and spiritual health following a disaster. And this is immediate to midterm. You'll probably look at the list and think, well, actually that applied for the first month or so, not sure how much it applies now. I'm going to say it still has application, but how we respond to it changes as the time frame, as the circumstances change. But we're still very much in not even midterm, we're still in the early stages of certainly of recovery and healing from the pandemic. So the 5 key principles are promoting a sense of safety, promoting calming, sense of self-efficacy and collective efficacy, connectedness and hope. Now, sense of safety, well, we have plenty of resources within our sacred texts about safety, the kind of images that we have there. Promoting a sense of safety within our liturgies will be drawing on the images of the one who provides care and security to the vulnerable. Some of the risk mitigation strategies that we need to put in place, and that are in fact about promoting a sense of safety, also break down links between people. So really looking forward to coming together for those that are still in lockdown, and then find that 1.5 metres is not a kind of distance for a good connecting conversation, that not being able to have a cup of tea is just, something's wrong, something's not quite working here, that seated, dotted all over the sanctuary just doesn't feel right. And because of that, there's increased anxiety about each other. And so part of promoting a sense of safety is assisting a sense of communication so that people know what's going on for each other. And so perhaps this is a time for, within liturgies, perhaps drawing on people making their faith statements within the congregation. As for people who have been worshipping with Zoom, recording, there's often been more people involved, more participants in leadership. That might actually continue to contribute to a sense of safety, a sense of community. Promoting calming, very close to that. The things that we did early on in the pandemic, more silence, more candles, simpler liturgy, those are things around promoting a sense of calm. What does it mean now? I'm asking that question rather than providing an answer. Promoting a sense of self-efficacy and communal efficacy, whether it was because we needed the people who had the tech skills, whether it was because intuitively we knew that people needed to be active in terms of leading community worship. In many places there were more people taking a role in leadership. Right back at the beginning, there was many places where the person who was in leadership instantly became a one-man band or one-woman band. And if that hasn't been addressed by now, that's a key consideration at this point. Moving away from any kind of narrowing that happened to giving space for the whole Christian community as the body, interdependent, working together, where community initiative and participation is happening, because that is absolutely crucial to the ongoing healing in the community. And promoting hope. Don't need to say much about, promoting connectedness. Okay, big one. During lockdown, churches that started off with very slick, beautiful recorded services because they had the technology, they had the people who could do it, often found that connectedness was breaking down, that it wasn't sufficient for people to watch something pre-recorded or even something streamed. And so many places started doing Zoom coffee hours and things like that. How the connectedness between people is promoted is so different in different communities. I can't tell you what worked for you or what will continue to work for you. All I know is that this is something which is going to be absolutely vital for the next 5 to 10 years. Patterns have broken down. People have stopped attending church every Sunday. You know, initially we had more people attending our online services than ever we saw coming through the doors. And now in South Australia, in many places, there was an initial peak in who attended face-to-face services, and now numbers are dropping off. I'm trying to think, in my own community, I reckon it's about 12% loss compared to before COVID. It'd be interesting to see what happens over the coming months. And in promoting connectedness, I think about all the cool things that happened during lockdown with, you know, teddy bears in windows, with pictures of people on church doors saying, you know, the community is still here. We're not in the building, but we're still here. The interesting things that people were doing around connectedness. Promoting hope, I already said, I don't need to say much about. That's our job. Our core business. For those that understand, they're known by God. Hope resides outside of our helplessness, and that actually is a more healing thing than people who look to their community to provide the hope. Our hope's bigger than that. Our hope is more powerful than that. And in addition to those 5 key principles, I always want to add self-care. At this time, all over the world, worship leaders are exhausted, totally fatigued. For some who are just thinking about perhaps a chance to worship face-to-face again, maybe there's a momentary rise in how they're feeling, but it's felt like there's been increased expectations on those who are leaders of faith community, a whole lot of adaptation that we've had to do. People are exhausted, so self-care is really important. When I think about people who are worshipping within the sanctuary, needing to find different ways of being for the current normal. I love the every alternate pew with a nice sign thing that came from a Baptist church in America. Interesting ways that people are managing to keep safe within worship. The fascinating attention again to ritual washing of hands, masking up during the first of the acclamations in the Eucharistic prayer. Interesting additions to, or different ways of seeing to our liturgical practice. One of my students wrote to me last week. I'm reading. It's going to take a decade to work through all the implications of the pandemic on people. I don't know what your church is like, but people's attitudes towards church has changed. Attitudes were changing already. It simply accelerated the processes. It doesn't worry me. However, it does mean we're having to constantly evaluate how we do church. That's what's taking the time and the energy. But the church here continues to be known in the community, so that's all good. There was a survey done by a woman in America, what's her name? Christine Longhurst, and I can send Kieran the link to her research if you want to use it. She was doing her research in May, so fairly early on, and amongst the challenges that were found to be pretty common, apart from leader fatigue, was the loss of connection, the loss of habit, increased expectations I've named already, but the good things, broader leadership, broader worship leadership, bringing generations together. Often in front of a screen, there were more generations than usual at a particular church service. Increased participation, so many places, particularly those that were using interactive means like Zoom, more immersive elements to worship. And here in South Australia, there are people, certainly in my congregation, who are really missing that. But immersive elements have been included even in printed materials, so where congregations chose to print a worship at home thing, often including an immersive element. Go into the garden, find some leaves, use this as part of the worship thing, and increasing outreach. My congregation has been worshipping in the sanctuary for many Sundays now, but we are continuing Zoom, and we're actually streaming that part of the worship that kind of works to be streamed, and then coming together for the Lord's Prayer and blessing and discuss and having a chat just on Zoom. But it means that we have people from 4 hours in one direction, 10 hours in another, 8 hours in another, all joining us for worship. People who had a connection with the congregation previously and haven't found a way to connect locally during this time. And there are certainly congregations where there are people who joined them during lockdown who hadn't been seen for years. There are people who have mental health issues who have found coming online to be much safer, and we have a couple of them joining us by Zoom rather than coming into the sanctuary. So rather than missing many Sundays because their anxiety is just too high or their social phobia, they're joining us every Sunday. There have been some really good things. There's been renewed creativity, a increased breadth of creativity around worship. People have adopted new technologies, resiliency, new rhythms. Many ministers finding actually they quite like being able to sleep in a bit on a Sunday morning. And looking ahead, some of the things that we predict are that virtual forms of worship are here to stay. It may be that small congregations that were struggling to put together worship for each Sunday are gathering together to watch streamed worship together and then have community activity together following that time, as well as places providing online worship because they found the outreach to be really significant. Adelaide West, which is a church just behind me here, are finding, I think she said 200, no, probably more than that, but anyway, huge number, still watching their streaming each Sunday. God's doing a new thing. We're not sure what it is, but it's exciting. We've certainly all learnt together the church is not a building, the church is the people. And one of the things that many people have found while they were in lockdown, they were doing simpler services, shorter sermons, and more congregational engagement. And my question about that is, what have we learned? What will we hang on to? How will this time of lockdown give us ideas for how to move forward? And just one other thing that I want to comment on before I hand it over to small group discussion. One of the things that has particularly affected me has been funerals during this time. We had been at a time where more and more families of our older members were not associated with the church and were starting to starting to not include the church in the rituals around the death of their family member. That's accelerated much more as far as I can see. And so we need to be thinking about how do we as communities just seize the opportunity to celebrate those people that were part of us with memorial services, not waiting for the family to invite us to do something, but just doing it because that's who we are. And how can we be offering our ritual leadership to families in a way that, I don't know, connects again? Is that possible? Has that role gone for many people? And something that I noticed with when we could only have 10 at funerals, many people really appreciated that small, intimate funeral. Is that one of the possibilities that we can be offering, where there is something for the family and something for the community as two separate things? Is there benefit in that? Have we learned anything about weddings by the small, intimate wedding? They're just random thoughts as we go. So we're all preparing to eventually accompany a grief and disillusionment phase. But the things that I'm really interested in having you discuss, I've got 5 questions here. Pick one, pick any. And I'll try and paste these into the broadcast to the chat rooms so that you can see them there. But it's up to you which, if any of these, you talk about. I wonder what changes were made to your liturgy during lockdown. I wonder which of these you anticipate keeping. How are you going to not just go straight back to what you did before, or straight back to what you did even years before, because as if all that time of developing as a community in the middle didn't happen? What creativity has been unleashed by COVID-19? What's this unusual time led you to discover about yourself and your faith community? And has this time created the space to think about different models of ministry that actually might be more appropriate for your regular people, for the broader community? Yeah, so those are my questions. So Kieran, back to you.
Okay, for this breakout session, I'm going to put you into smaller groups. So I will try and make sure that the maximum number of people in a breakout room is 3, because there's a lot to discuss. The breakout rooms will close automatically after 6 minutes.
So you better choose 1 or 2 questions, not try and answer them all.
And I'm mindful that we are due to complete our meeting at 6 o'clock Melbourne time. We may run over by 10 minutes or so if people wish to continue. However, we do need to be mindful that we have given 6 o'clock in Melbourne time as our finish time. So for the next 6 minutes, please do discuss vigorously.
Thanks, Tanya. Same graph for talking about fire recovery, so it was interesting to hear it from the code.
Yeah. Matt, somehow you've been muted again. I don't know if you muted yourself or if it happened automatically. Okay. But yes, it's the thing that has been really obvious is that we can learn from fire recovery. The key thing is that with a fire, even those that go on and on and on and revisit, there is an end point, and it's been a much quicker end point. And so the process of recovery for a pandemic is just going to be that much longer.
Are there any other reflections that have come from your breakout discussions Please feel free to unmute yourself, and if you want to speak while someone else is speaking, please use the chat to raise your hand virtually.
Kieran, we were reflecting, we've had some lovely reflections in our group, but one of the things that I noticed from my own personal experience, that because Catholic worship is very much priest-centred, we've often felt like that we've missed the opportunity to encourage people to be lay leaders of prayer. And I would love them to actually discover the riches of, the prayer of the church, morning and evening prayer. But I think what we've found now is that in some places we've had people from, 9 or 10 or 8 different parishes joining in for an evening prayer ritual every couple of weeks. That's now on hold until Advent, but it's been fantastic. And although the priests have been there, everyone's sort of taken a turn at doing things, and I'm very grateful to the parish that had actually kick-started that. So it's been a wonderful, just a wonderful spiritual connection with people from other parishes. So I'm hoping that that will continue, because here in the country, if you have to travel some distance at night, people are reluctant to do that. So, I think a mixture of the physical worship, of course, we want to be physically reunited, but also I think the online stuff in some way or form, whatever way that happens to be, is here to stay, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and the collaboration is so much easier, which is wonderful. Anne, were you going to say something, or were you just... No?
Howard Harris makes an interesting point about endpoints and closure. I wonder, Howard, if you might say something a little more about that.
Well, I was just thinking, I came in as we were coming back from the breakout rooms to, I think, an exchange between you and Tanya about learning from fires. And there was a comment about after the fire there is an end point. And for a moment I saw that the fire has gone and your house is destroyed or whatever it is, and that is an end point. But then I went on and thought that there are people who I expect still years after some fires are saying something or other has to happen. We haven't yet got closure.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what that will mean for Christian worship. Will there be people who think that the crisis is over? I go back to Tanya's very complicated graph with the line that wobbled up and down.
Yeah.
And if it was going to take 10 years, I suppose one could argue that it didn't matter whether you started after 6 months or 9 months or 12 months. From 10 years on, it was going to look, there's been a lot of talk about 2020 was the bad year. So when will we...
If I can come in there. Yes, with a fire, it ends. The fire is put out. There comes a time where even the underground fires and the fence posts are cool. But the actual impact of the fire goes on and on and on. From the fires of last summer, many people are still homeless. Certainly, much ground is where it was hottest. There's not even the little bit of spring growth because everything was decimated by that heat. And so the healing from that, the trauma continues, and the healing will take a long time. With COVID, we have been exceptionally lucky here in that the trauma has not been as great on us as a community. Certainly it has been on individual families, but on the broader community, no. And there are many faith communities that have been quite protected from it. You know, pensions have stayed the same for those that are mostly older people, for example. So there hasn't even been the financial impact. Yeah, sure, there's shops that are closed in town, but that's happened before, you know. But as there has been a change within our community, a change within connection, people have been impacted in different ways, which has driven wedges between people. And so that's why I'm saying this is a 10-year process. There will be a time where I think we'll be able to look back and say the impact of COVID is no longer rocking us. You know, we're no longer on a boat going up and down, but that's a long while in the future. However, that thing about people will be looking for an end point, I think part of healing is actually celebrating waypoints. Churches who come together to celebrate that it's all finished, hurrah, hurrah, are probably jumping the gun. But churches that come together to say, this phase is finished, what's coming, what's the new ahead of us, will be well served.
I see Colleen O'Reilly has her hand raised. So, Colleen.
Yes, I was struck by the comment about funerals because, as people know, the trend towards so-called secular funerals, funerals in the funeral parlour, even if we take them as clergy, has been rushing onwards. And I suspect that's going to be one of the biggest, one big outcome will be the loss of the possibility of a genuinely Christian funeral. So people are going to need to specify to their family, I want my funeral at St. Bloggs. And I think that's going to have to be something that we'll teach people, you know.
I think you're right, but unless the family is respectful of those wishes, it might not make a difference.
No.
Sharing one experience, my friend had specified where the funeral should be, who should take it, what she would be wearing, what was going to be on the coffin, and she had actually written out the liturgy and done everything except written out the sermon, and she would have done that probably if we'd given her a bit more time. But the family chose to have none of that. So as a congregation, we decided, okay, we will. But the family said, no, it is not a funeral, it is not a memorial service, you may not call it that, and we don't approve and do not mention our names. So we had a thing, and we just said it's a thing. It's a thing for her.
Yeah.
Really like your image, Michelle. Sometimes the fire cracks the seed to allow new life to bloom. That's what I'm really hoping for. You know, I've said the choices we make at this time are between vitality or further decline. How are we going to find that vitality? Where is it? What can we seize? Linda, I'm not predicting.
Just to clarify for those who won't see the chat because this will be on a video, Linda's question is, in Melbourne's lockdown, how do you think this will affect our churches into the future? Well, Linda, welcome to the Academy. Membership is open to all, and we would be delighted to welcome you to our ranks. Stay tuned.
Learn from each other, you know, look around, what's fun. That was one of the wonderful things about online stuff. People could church hop. Some people went to 5 or 6 different worships in a day. You know, learn from it.
I wonder, because this is a question that was raised by a member of the chapter who was giving an apology and an extended reflection. And the question was around access to sacraments and community celebration as a sacramental thing in itself. How does this, is this part of our church's brief to provide not merely connectedness, but hope? What role does the reconnection to sacraments play in the way we recover collectively from what we've experienced with COVID?
How long is a piece of string? Yeah. How many different individuals have such different responses? Different communities have such different responses. I have this is a student of ACD who at the moment is writing a thesis on sacramental sausages, because gathering in the park, when it was possible, for sausages on a bit of bread, she could see was sacrament for the community that was coming into being. Can we release ourselves from the restriction of the things that we've learnt and the things we've always done to see what new things God might be doing? New ways of celebrating, new ways of recognising how God is present and working with each of us.
Yes. Unless anybody else is going to raise a hand.
Fiona, did you raise a hand just then, or were you brushing hair away?
Oh, I was just saying that our group really focused on the simplicity and how that's really allowed us to sort of savour things differently, and also the prayer groups that have sprung up that wouldn't have actually sprung up before, because, as Sophie mentioned before, we're quite focused on the Mass as Catholics, and this has actually allowed us space to actually really unpack our prayer differently. And so we've found in our parish that there's a really strong prayer group now that meets regularly to savour the scriptures for Sunday. So yeah, it's been really positive in lots of unexpected ways.
I read an article, I can't remember whether it was from Europe or North America, but about the Catholic Church and how COVID had really accelerated what they were calling anti-clericalism. I would prefer to give it a different name. I would prefer to give it really accelerated the community of the saints, the fellowship of all believers, the actual activity of the assembly in the groups they have chosen with the activity that they've shaped for themselves. I rejoice in that.
Yeah. Our priest is very empowering, so his idea is not centred on himself. It's about animating the baptismal gifts of the people. So this has actually been a great opportunity to do that more.
The priesthood of all believers. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Beverly.
I was just going to say the one obvious comment just to make, but it has been brought up in other places, is the fact that we've been experiencing church on Zoom face to face. We can see everybody. And when we go back into our buildings, while we've been 10, we've been in a semicircle, we can still see each other. We've still got that. We haven't got physical contact, but we've got eye-to-eye contact. But when we go back into our pews, because we're getting bigger numbers, we're going to be behind each other. And it's going to be interesting to see what dynamic that brings in a time when we can't touch in the way we've always known. We can't face each other in the way we've always known.
People in my congregation who found it really hard to be looking at the back of people's heads again.
And of course, there will be added rituals around masks, face shields, hand sanitizer.
And it leads me to think about some of the rituals that we have where we're given the theological justification for why they're part of the Mass. But you look at them and you think, oh, I wonder if this came into being during a plague, you know.
Yes. This seems like a good time to draw our discussion together. As I say, we're mindful of time and that people have committed to be with us till the scheduled finish time. Firstly, I want to say thank you to Tanya for leading us in such a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. It's a real joy to welcome you and to welcome you as a collaborator across borders that are presently closed, that is between Victoria and South Australia. We do, however, look forward to the opening of borders very soon. Before we finish, there are two things I just want to make sure that we note. Those of you who knew Maria George will be saddened to hear that she passed away a few weeks ago. Maria was a well-loved friend and colleague to many in the chapter here. She worked for a very long time as a pastoral associate in Catholic parishes around Melbourne, and had an influence that extended beyond Melbourne itself out into the broader Catholic Church in Victoria. With the concurrence of our members, I will make contact with her family and pass on our chapter's condolences, and to let them know that we have remembered Maria in prayer at our meeting tonight. The second thing, which is looking into the future, builds on our conversation today somewhat. The Victoria chapter was due to host the Australian Academy of Liturgy National Conference 2021, which was deferred for 12 months, and so is now the Australian Academy of Liturgy National Conference 2022. When we made the decision to defer the meeting, we undertook that we would hold an online national meeting, and this will be happening for one day only on Saturday, the 16th of January 2021. It will be an open space technology meeting, which will be convened by our very highly esteemed friend and colleague in the chapter, Nathan Nettleton. You will be able to join by Zoom. Obviously, the process will be made clearer to those who register. It will be a long meeting for online standards. We will be starting at 11 a.m. and running to 5 p.m. Melbourne time, that is Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. The meeting is to discuss a question: what has COVID revealed about participation in Christian worship and community? There is an opportunity for people to participate by submitting papers, which can be given as video submissions, which will be published on YouTube prior to the conference and made available afterwards. And for Academy members, of course, we know that an important part of our national gatherings is convivium. I think actually for some people that's the main purpose of coming to conferences. And so we will be holding convivium in the evening of Friday, the 15th of January 2021, and that will be held by Zoom in the evening, so that we have that social time and connectedness. And I think there's even talk of using breakout rooms as a kind of academy speed dating, get to know you kind of thing. So registrations are currently open for that. Please look us up on Eventbrite. There is a modest cover charge just to cover our expenses for the technology involved. We hope that many people will join us, and please let others know. As we go our way, I'd like to share a prayer that is a blessing from Brooke Prentice, who is the National CEO of Common Grace. Brooke will be joining us at our conference in 2022 as one of our keynote panel. And this is a prayer that comes out of Indigenous spirituality and that calls us to mind here in Australia of how we walk on sacred ground. So let us pray. May our footsteps on these ancient lands remind us of creation and connectedness in our search for truth. May the gum tree, from its roots to its branches, remind us to dig deep and reach high in our action for justice. May the eagle who soars in the sky remind us of the power in our call for love. May the expanse of the lands and seas, of the sky and stars, remind us of God's timing in our faith and hope. May the Holy Three, Creator Spirit, Lord God, Papa Jesus, remind us of community. Now with grace, mercy and peace, let us go forth in truth, justice, love and hope. Amen. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a real joy to have you here. And as we go our ways, I hope that wherever you are, you can build connectedness and hope. And thank you to Tanya for leading us in our discussion tonight and for resourcing us in that task of living together in community.